Alright, so check this out. Yuba River. Here's your trigger warning for violence against women. I lurk on these subs a bit, but hadn't considered sharing until recently. I'm from Northern California, and I spent a lot of time backpacking and primitive camping in various parks throughout the region. I've never been a big fan of car camping, simply because people are trouble and I aim to avoid them in nature. This incident further solidified my original feelings and has prevented me from doing any camping at more populated sites since. A couple of years back, two of my girlfriends and I decided, on a whim, to head north and camp alongside the Yuba River. We had a decent day, swimming and sunning ourselves on the rocks, before we headed back to camp to cook dinner. All in all, it was a lovely day. We were all sleeping in separate tents, and I should mention that one of my friends is a heavy sleeper, and the other had a good amount to drink and was out cold. Around 2 a.m., I woke suddenly. I was disoriented, and it took me a moment to realize the sounds that I was hearing was a woman in distress. She was desperately pleading with someone. Her cries became hysterical screams, and it quickly became evident that she was being beaten. Without thinking, I exited my tent and attempted to wake my girlfriends. I was panicked and frightened, and my instinct was to avoid making too much noise. I was unable to stir either of them. I felt like I was virtually useless and would likely get myself injured or worse if I were to intervene, but I couldn't sit idly by while someone was being hurt. So I grabbed my buck knife, and with the moon high overhead, I cautiously crept towards the commotion. As I faltered toward the clearing of their campsite, suddenly, to my left, I heard loud footsteps, and a man emerged from the woods. He gestured for me to keep quiet, and his confident, and frankly his pissed demeanor and gait put me instantly at ease. I could hear a kerfuffle, and shortly after, the man emerged with the woman, a young boy, and 2 chihuahuas. She was overwrought and didn't want to be near the man who had come to her aid, and insisted she only wanted to speak with me. She told me they were in between housing and that this was just an isolated incident. The abuse had clearly been prolonged and frequent, considering that she had old bruises and injuries all over her body. I recognize now that I could have handled what would be the remainder of the night in a smarter and safer way, but I'll live and learn, I guess. There was no cell service, and she didn't want to leave the campground. I offered my tent to her and her son, and I slept in my truck. By the morning light, she was gone. I felt completely deflated and depressed. What was supposed to be a light-hearted getaway had turned heavy and bleak. I made coffee for my campmates, and we discussed the events of the night and decided that we just wanted to go home. We packed up, and I thought to brush my teeth before hitting the road. I'm going to town when all of a sudden, this absolute ghoul of a man begins trudging up the hill toward me. He's tall, scrawny, prematurely balding, and looks about as clammy as hell. He was screaming F and B this and F and B that, and it's readily apparent that this was the culprit from the previous evening. He begins frantically scanning the forest floor and picks up a large rock while honing in on me. Instead of feeling afraid in this moment, I'm livid. I happen to be a DV survivor, and even if this weren't the case, this slimy piece of trash was threatening me. With toothpaste still foaming at my mouth, I shout back that he's a coward, but I guess he thinks he's a big man because he's not afraid to hit a woman. I like to think that I looked rabid. Long story short, another man bursts through the trees and clotheslined this loser. So, yeah, I'm not really afraid of wildlife, just humans. Date gone wrong. In June of 2023, I was on a lot of dating apps and would meet people regularly to hook up. I was texting with someone and he invited me over. I took an Uber to his place in the afternoon. The building was old and a bit creepy. I started feeling unsafe, but my rational side took over and I went in. The front door was broken, so I was able to get in. I texted him that I had just got there and was waiting for him to show up. A few minutes later, I knocked at what I thought was his apartment. He texted me, "Mine is apartment 9." But he wasn't in there. I went back to the lobby and texted that I was leaving in the next few minutes since I didn't get any reply. Just then, a man shows up in the lobby and I follow him to apartment 15. I said, "Oh, that's weird. Why would you tell me you lived in apartment 9? He replies, "No, I live here in apartment 15. I tell him, "Yeah, I see that, but you said apartment 9. Why?" He didn't seem to fully understand my question. He looked a bit intoxicated. Apartment 15 was disgusting. Trash everywhere, and it smelled like death. I knew I had to leave, but I didn't want to offend him. At this point, I've been in the apartment for just a few minutes. He says, "Blow me." I go, "No, ain't no effing way." Then I show him our text messages. I ask this dude, "Is this your phone number?" He replies, "No." I panic. I tell him that I have to leave. I unlock the door, I opened it, and then I step outside. And that's when I feel something on my back. He was burning me with a cigarette. He then tried to pull me back inside. He beat me up and stole my bag. I was on the floor of the hallway when he kicked me in the face and then closed the door. I ran outside to call the cops. My jaw was fractured on both sides. I lost a tooth and chipped another one. And now this random man that I followed to apartment 15 is in jail, and we're waiting for the court to know exactly how much time he will serve. The man with the ladder and bad intentions. When I was a senior in college a few years ago, I lived in an old house about a 5-minute walk from my campus with 5 of my girlfriends. It was still COVID time, so we spent a lot of time just in the house since we couldn't really go anywhere. To preface this house was old, and many of the windows didn't lock. Our landlord sucked, as many college ones do, and didn't do anything to fix this issue. But with it being 6 of us and often at least one boyfriend or 2 sleeping in the house, it felt mostly safe, and many of us would just keep our windows open. Our college was in a town just outside of the second most dangerous city in the state. But right around the campus, it felt relatively safe. When the weather started getting warmer in early spring, We would sit out on the roof to sunbathe, and this roof faced our street. We would access the roof from my roommate's, let's call her Mary, from Mary's bedroom window on the second floor since it led straight to the roof. Our street was residential and we didn't get a ton of traffic, but we did have a couple of encounters of younger guys catcalling us as they drove by, but nothing seemed really sinister as we were just college kids. One night, late in the semester, Mary went up to her room to call her brother while the rest of us were hanging around downstairs. That's when she rushed downstairs and said that she saw a ladder leading up to the roof where we would all sunbathe, and right near her window, which was open. Later, we learned that she said out loud to her brother what she saw before she came down. When she told us this, my other roommate and her boyfriend ran outside to find a man running away from our house with the freaking ladder, who we assumed just heard Mary telling her brother that she saw the ladder and knew he was caught. It was dark, so they couldn't make out anything about him. I immediately texted our landlord asking if he had someone come by the house to do any work, but he said no. We then called the police, who came by. They did some investigating and patrolled our house for a couple of nights, but we never found out who the man was, what his intentions were, or if he had been there before. I've been waking up at 3:30 every day for a while now, and I do that so I have time to either go to the gym or record content for you before the rest of my family wakes up and we start our day. This means I usually got really tired and I hit some sort of wall at about 7 p.m. most days. I was a little irritable, a little foggy, and honestly dead tired. But since I've been taking Magic Mind every day for, the last 3 months now, I don't hit that 7 o'clock wall anymore. I still wake up at 3:30, go to the gym, make content, go to work, hang out with the family, but that 7 p.m. wall isn't there. And it doesn't matter if I take my Magic Mind in the morning or in the afternoon. I feel like as long as I just get it in sometime throughout the day, my night goes smooth, and I want the same for you. Now, I'm not asking you to wake up at 3:30 with me to go work out or record a podcast, but I know that you've got things that you need to do throughout your day and things that you want to do. If you come home at the end of the day after work and you are too tired to work on your own passions or even clean the house sometimes, I get it. We're human. But this helps. I don't know what it is in Magic Mind that helps me unlock my creativity, my focus, or my productivity, but I do know that the ingredients are all organic and they are of the highest quality. Check out the website in my description to visit magicmind.com and use the code ScaryStories20 to get up to 48% off your subscription. Joey Crack. This happened while I was in my early 20s. My best friend was always getting into risky stuff. While she did various drugs, I was always more of a pothead. When they said pot was a gateway drug, I believe it's true to a certain extent for those who have more addictive personalities. She definitely developed an addiction issue later on. My friend, her name was KK, was always down to meet people. She used to friend random people on Facebook or Instagram. And she would ask me to hang out so that way when she met people, I was the buffer, just in case they didn't like each other. One day, she came over to my house unannounced and said, "Hey, let's go to my uncle's house," because her aunt was there and her aunt had some goods. Her aunts happened to be down the road. Her aunt and uncle were known as dealers in the area. So we went. When we got there, she was like, "Hey, I met this guy online. He goes by Joey Crack." She then shows her aunts his pictures, and he's a wide-set man with a red goofy face, cornrow braids, face tats, and a gold grill. I laughed and said, "Wow, Kay, you really know how to pick 'em." She had already invited him over, so upon his arrival, he then comes out of nowhere, just walks right up to Kay, gives a hug, and everyone else there a kiss on the cheek. This part of town, there was nothing around, just houses, a school, and the woods. The closest store was about 20 minutes, so it struck me as odd that he walked there. Anyway, it was me, Kay, her aunt, and the aunt's friend. We sit and we get 3 joints in rotation. By this time, both aunts are high as a kite on coke. They take a few puffs and then go inside the house, leaving me, Kay, and Mr. Joey Crack outside. Joey then starts asking us questions like how we know each other, what we did for a living, stuff like that. It was getting late, so I was telling her that I was going to go home. She was like, No, don't go yet. I told her I was tired and that Joey is weird, and he kept low-key hitting on me. She then tells me that he asked to sleep with her and he wanted to ask her if I was down. I laughed it off and said, "Ya crazy." And after a bit of silence, I deflected and I heard some noise that was in the darkness. "You heard that?" After a bit of small talk between him and Kay, he learned that neither of us was interested and that this was just going to be a hangout. This then turns the mood, and you can feel it. It was suddenly eerie quiet. He got real reserved and shifty-eyed. I sat down for a while just to please Kay. At one point, I turned to Joey. Knowing he walked here and it was dark by now, I said, "What are you about to do?" Because I'm about to go home and Kay's coming with me. He said, "Oh, yeah, I just texted my boy. He's about to get me." When he was texting, Kay was right behind him, watching what he was texting. Her eyes grew wide, and then she looked at me. That was silent girl code for emergency. Kay broke the silence and was like, "Hey, come help me get this thing from inside to bring it out." So I did. We went inside and she goes, "I'm gonna call my uncle so he can take us to your place." I said, "Why? My house was like a 10-minute walk." She said because she was looking at what Joey was texting. He sent to whoever was coming to pick him up the information of all of us here. He noted that her aunts were both high and all of our ages and stuff like that. He was telling his boy to come over to basically rob and take advantage of us. And he called dibs on the blonde one. I was the blonde one. Every hair stood up on my body with that thought of some gross goon trying to have his way with me. I was pissed because she got me into this. We came back out and continued our conversation with him so he wouldn't get suspicious of us. She mentions out loud that her uncle was on his way home. As he pulls in, a sigh of relief comes over me. They speak briefly, and Joey then departs into the darkness before his ride even shows up. Kay and I get a ride from her uncle to my house. On the ride, we noted how weird Joey was. Later that night, as I was going to bed, I checked my Facebook, and I have a friend request from Joey and a message that reads, "You're so pretty. I would love some alone time with you without your friend." The message ended with his phone number, and I never blocked someone so fast. After this, Kay didn't learn her lesson, but that's another story for another time. A week later, Joey was in the news. He was wanted for SA, robbery, and drug possession. That was a bullet well missed on my part. Crazy man holds my girlfriend and I at gunpoint. This takes place in the rural farmland of the southeastern United States. For those from around the area, you'll know that there isn't much around except for old farmhouses, fields, and the occasional subdivision. When I was around 17 or 18, I was dating a girl who went to the same high school as me. Being teenagers, we needed a place to be alone, and what better than the front seat of my F-150? It was often hard to find a place to park that was away from the road and was far enough away from everyone else. One evening, as the sun was getting ready to set, I remembered an abandoned house with a long driveway and a tobacco barn, off of some old back road with no other houses. I had been there before and explored the property. The house's roof had been abandoned long ago and currently had been used to store lumber. The house had no doors or windows left, and the rest of the property was clearly in disrepair and didn't appear to be used at all. I figured this long-forgotten property would make a good spot, so I drove my truck up into the driveway, far away from prying eyes. I put my truck in park, lifted up my center console, and put on the radio. As my girlfriend and I were talking, she suddenly stops with her eyes glued to the rearview mirror and says, I think someone's here." I initially blew it off as I was fairly confident that no one was around for miles. But I glanced in my rearview to see a very beat-up looking Ford truck that had pulled up directly behind mine, and the door flew open. Out jumped a tall, dirty-looking man holding what appeared to be a .30-06 with a weathered wooden stock. As I put my window down, the man advances, yelling all types of obscenities from the side of my truck. As he walks up, I hear the distinct sound of the safety clicking off of an older rifle. I froze as the world stopped around me. I'd never been held at gunpoint before. As soon as the shock wore off, I threw my hands up and I see the man had his sights aimed on me through the rear window of my truck. I looked over to my girlfriend, who was frozen in shock and somewhat cowered into the passenger door. I remember feeling helpless and reaching for my pistol that I usually had between the seats, which I quickly realized I'd left at home. This was probably a blessing in disguise, though, as the strange man was clearly belligerent and under the influence of something. I'm sure him seeing my pistol would have just sent him more over the edge. As my hands are up and my girlfriend is shaking in fear, I eventually mutter out, "What's going on, sir?" The man, through rotten and missing teeth, shouts, "You sons of bees come out here, tearing up my field and ruining my crops." He clearly had mistaken me for some of the ATV riders around the area who would often wander onto private property and tear up the land. Looking at the man, he didn't look like any of the farmers that I had known around the area, having lived there for 15 years at this point. I was fairly familiar with the local farmers. This supposed farmer looked maybe in his early 30s and looked to me more like the junkies that I would see downtown. I replied to the man that I had never been here before, nor that I was responsible for destroying his crops, trying desperately to defuse the situation. He wanted to hear none of it and continued to mutter on while still holding me at gunpoint. I waited for a break in his incoherent babbling to apologize profusely and say, "Sir, if I had seen a no trespassing sign, I wouldn't have dared step foot on the property." The man advanced from behind my truck to my open window to yell, "Didn't you see no effing sign?" He didn't believe me. As I studied him, he continued to grip the rifle tighter and tighter and mumble to himself. I apologized some more and offered to leave when I noticed that he has me completely blocked in, and there was nowhere for me to go. As soon as I mentioned leaving, he perked up and dropped the rifle ever so slightly, putting us out of immediate danger. My fight or flight briefly chose fight, but I knew there was no way to jump out of the truck and get to him before he could shoot. Time seemed to slow, and I felt like the silence that ensued lasted hours. He started to yell obscenities again, but started to walk back to his truck. As he passes my rear bumper, my girlfriend and I exchanged glances. I'd never seen a fear like that in anyone's eyes before, let alone someone I loved. I knew I had to do whatever I could to get away from this unhinged stranger. I fired up my truck and I put it in reverse as he does the same. His beat-up Ford backed into the road and stopped, waiting for me to exit. I backed into the road as well, my eyes never leaving the rearview mirror. And as soon as there was enough space, I threw the truck into drive and stomped the gas pedal down as far as it could go. My tires squealed and the truck roared as it ran through the gears. I was familiar with the roads and was confident that I could outrun him if need be. I mean, his truck looked like it was on its last leg. As the speedometer flew past 60, I could see the man following us, but with enough distance from my truck that it would be hard to put a hole in my tailgate. My girlfriend is calming down at this point and is trying to rationalize what just happened to us. I drove and drove for several miles, constantly looking behind to see if he was following. I briefly remember doing over 100 miles an hour at some point. The mood in the cab changed to utter disbelief as we talk about how crazy the supposed farmer looked and awkwardly laughing off our near deaths. I never saw that man again after and never returned to the abandoned house, except for the next day to leave him some ruts in the front yard of the rundown property. Looking back, I haven't the slightest idea as to how the man knew we were there, as we weren't visible from the road, nor were we followed. I personally think that he was just some tweaker, because I knew most of all the farmers in the area, and being in a small town, you know everybody. I'd never seen this man, nor have I ever seen him since. I certainly was in the wrong, being on private property, and had heard horror stories of people running from crazed farmers as bullets flew over their heads. However, a couple of kids parked up in what was clearly a forgotten property several 100 yards from the nearest field shouldn't have warranted a firearm pointed at me and my girlfriend, who were sitting in a clean truck that obviously hadn't been tearing up any fields. Coming from a farming family and being close with the farmers in the area, the last thing you would catch me doing as tearing up someone's livelihood. Regardless, I put my girlfriend and my life at stake that night just to park up somewhere and fool around. I never made that mistake again. Someone watched me sleep in the aftermath of Hurricane Ida. On August 29th, 2021, Hurricane Ida made landfall in the New Orleans area. Her Category 4 force winds uprooted large, mature oak trees, leaving them keeled over in the roads and on houses as if a giant hand picked them right out of the ground like weeds. It was a sight to behold. This wasn't my first hurricane by any means. The first one I remember hunkering down for was Hurricane Andrew in 1992. I had just turned 10 and lived in Baton Rouge, Louisiana at the time with my family. Although he was a nightmare Category 5 whose sounds I've never been able to forget, he wasn't the scariest. In the years to come, I'd find myself living in New Orleans when Hurricane Katrina ravaged our city. Then there was that time in 2008 when I evacuated back home to Baton Rouge for Hurricane Gustav, only to be nearly impaled by a tree branch that flew through my parents' dining room window at 100 miles an hour. 4 years later, Hurricane Ivan ruined long-awaited plans to sit at the chef's table at Commander's Palace, a world-renowned restaurant in New Orleans. Fast forward to 2020, and Hurricane Zeta swooped in just days before the official end to hurricane season, delaying Halloween in the process and setting an electric pole on fire in front of my house. But 16 years to the day from Hurricane Katrina, Ida pushed in and had something else in store for me. The storm raged in the evening hours, getting stronger as it grew darker. She brought her A-game that night, toppling a massive transmission tower and its power lines into the mighty Mississippi River. Power would be out for days, if not weeks, and even months for some people. In spite of my desperate pleas to the universe, God, Jesus, anyone, the electricity would be out in our area for 10 grueling days. The heat during the next week and a half was brutal. Record-setting temps combined with 100% humidity meant it was literally impossible to cool yourself off. I'm talking about that heat that is straight up dangerous. We were fortunate enough to have a small but very loud generator with which we powered our fridge, 2 large fans, and a TV so we could keep an eye on the news. We kept it running a few hours at a time just to conserve gas, but ran it mostly at night so we could all get some much-needed sleep. My husband and 3 small daughters decided that we'd all sleep in the living room so we could all benefit from the blessed breeze the fans provided. The nights were darker than I've ever experienced, aside from the time a tour guide turned off his flashlight in the bowels of a cave in Tennessee. It was pretty damn spooky outside. We live on a busy boulevard, and the double front doors of our house open into the living room. But no one uses the front doors. Ever. Before you can get to them, you have to get through an outer set of iron gates set just 3 feet in front of the doors. I've unlocked and opened them maybe 3 times in the last 9 years that I've lived here. After a disaster of this magnitude, the city officials declared a curfew to curb any robberies of vacant homes and any other crimes. No one should be out past the hours of 9 p.m. or so. On this particular night, my family and I settled in to watch the news and drift off to sleep. I slept on the chase portion of our L-shaped couch. We kept the front doors open and the outer iron gates were locked as usual. I had been sleeping in a tank top and just my underwear because did I mention it was hot AF? We had all fallen asleep with the TV still on, so it was bright, relatively speaking, inside the room. It's 4 a.m. and suddenly my eyes pop open to the smell of fresh cigarette smoke and the deeply unsettling feeling that someone is staring at me. I can hear the blood rushing through my ears as I stare out the door and into the pitch black just beyond them. The horrifying realization that someone was just mere feet away, taking drags on their cigarette while watching my young family sleep was too much to bear. I grabbed the nearby remote and turned the TV off. Now, I too was under the cover of darkness. I quietly woke my husband, who also smelled the smoke. By now, the voyeur was surely gone, but we'll never know when he really left. All we could hear was the roar of the generator outside and the loud humming of our fans. My boyfriend saw me, but it wasn't me. I'm writing this in a bit of a panic because some weird stuff just happened and it reminded me of a strange experience my boyfriend had a while back. We live in a ground-level apartment in Nashville with good security. A while back, maybe like 6 months ago, my boyfriend called me around 2 p.m. on a weekday with a strange question. He asked me if I was standing outside our front door. I responded with the truth, which was that I was at work still. He started fully freaking out, saying that he was playing RimWorld and heard a loud knock at the door. He checked the peephole and saw who he thought was me, allegedly wearing the same clothes that I had left in that morning. But I never use our front door. I have a key, so I'd let myself in, and not to mention, I was 20 minutes away in my office. He said that when he heard the knock and started approaching the door, he got sort of a sickly feeling, like something was wrong. And when he looked through the peephole and saw me, he almost threw up from the feeling. This figure, standing at the door, was wearing a lanyard, like how I wear a lanyard for work, dressed in the same clothes, all that. But her head was down, and she was standing in a way that he described as really off. He was too scared to look through the peephole again, and just hunkered down in the living room while we stayed on the phone. Also, disclaimer here, my boyfriend is a bit of an over-exaggerator at times, so I acknowledge that. But I'm also a firm believer in the spooky things in life, having my own paranormal experiences throughout the years with ghosts and cryptids. So fast forward to today. We're gaming at like midnight, and I hear a loud knock at the door. He didn't hear it, but I waited to see if there was another and decided it was probably just him knocking his chair into his desk or something. 10 minutes later, there's another knock, and this time we both hear it. We look at each other and then go to the front door to look out. There's no one there, but there is a spot to the left of our door that isn't visible through the peephole, so I tell him not to open the door to check in case someone is there waiting for that very thing to happen. I go to close the blinds and keep listening for anything strange, but nothing else happens. This whole thing brought up the previous story of my apparent doppelganger, and I wanted to post it here in case anyone had a similar experience with mimics or things like that in urban areas. I myself had a run-in with a Wendigo when I lived up north, but I find it hard to believe those or skinwalkers would be here in a metro area. Does anyone have any input or similar stories or just general information on what this could have been standing on the other side of our door that day? Scary holiday house shenanigans. The year is 2016, I think, and I'm pretty sure it was September. My family, which is my parents, our dog, and yours truly, went to France for a vacation. My mother had picked a nice-looking holiday home close to the French city of Aubernay. So we arrived there, and the landlady greeted us. Communication was a little odd since she was French, and my parents speak very little French or English, and I couldn't speak English too well either, as I was 12 back then. Though both I and my parents remember how she kind of nervously explained to us that we definitely have to activate the alarm system every night and to lock the doors leading to the lounge/winter garden with a large metal shutter that, at least to 12-year-old me, reminded me more of blast doors. Another thing that struck my parents and me as odd was that we weren't shown all of the house. So, with my dad and I being very curious, we tried to look around some more and found some odd stuff. There were 2 upstairs bedrooms and 1 on the ground level. The bedroom on the ground level was normal, apart from the window not closing properly, but the upstairs bedrooms, those were strange. One of the upstairs bedrooms had like 5 or 6 beds, and none of them faced each other. I don't know. We shrugged it off as the beds just being arranged in odd ways. The second upstairs bedroom had a very large bed and a second door, standing to the left of the bed. The door was locked, and we weren't given a key for it. A similar door was across the upstairs hallway next to the bathroom upstairs. It apparently led to a small balcony, which also led to another door, which obviously couldn't be accessed either. The creepiest part, though, was the basement. We weren't shown the basement by the landlord, but the key that we did have fit the basement door, so me and my dad went down there just out of curiosity. It was a stairway that led into an L or a Z-shaped basement. It was pretty normal at first, but the end was concerning. The last part of the basement was tiled and had a very amateur mosaic of a red figure with black hair, which seemed like a woman to me and my dad. My dad also claimed that there were what looked like meat hooks in the walls when talking with him about the basement. So, we stayed here for a week, and then some odd things started happening. First of all, we all had a pretty scary feeling when it got dark, which in a house that throws so many red flags at you is maybe normal. Secondly, I'm like 80% sure I heard some noises coming from that locked door in the upstairs bedroom, like the creaking of some old floorboards or something. I also felt like I was being watched and that I was depressed, which is, odd for a vacation. Feeling like that could be normal though, since I tend to have paranoia from time to time, so maybe that was just the paranoia showing rather early in my life due to the circumstances. And lastly, and this was the most scary thing that happened, our dog, an English Labrador Retriever, who is usually the most chilled creature on Earth, had what basically boils down to the dog version of a panic attack in the middle of the night. I was in another bedroom when this happened, so this relies fully on the accounts of my parents. Basically, our dog started to wail and seemed extremely scared in the middle of the night, waking up both my parents. He seemed terrified and he kept howling and wailing for like 2 hours, refusing to go back to sleep before finally calming down. I can confirm that this dog has never reacted to anything like that before. No fireworks, no fear of water, no fear of loud noises, nothing. We stayed there the whole week, but we were all kind of relieved when we left. I can elaborate on some things if you'd like to know more, but this is everything I can think of that it's important right now. I still dream of this house to this day, and I feel shivers running down my spine when I think about it. There was some follow-up questions asked by a user that include, the basement. Did you hear any noises in the basement? Also, was your dog fine once you got back home? And other than the dreams, did you feel better when you were back home? OP replies with, I didn't hear any noises in the basement. At least, none that would be memorable. I asked my dad and he couldn't remember any noises from down there either. Our dog was fine afterwards for 3 more years, then our goodest boy sadly passed from arthrosis in 2019. I had a couple of nightmares of that place afterwards, but stretched out over many years. And yeah, I obviously felt better coming home since that place really creeped me out. The vacation itself was nice, and Obernai is a beautiful town, but the house was kind of eerie, and being rather young back then, I wasn't sleeping too well for obvious reasons. Thank you for asking. What if I did go? One night, when I was 15 and living in my old house in Pittsburgh, I had a good friend over who I'll call Trey. We were sitting in my room playing the Nintendo Wii since that was the only system that I had at the time. We'd been playing for about an hour when Trey said, Dude, I'm getting bored. We don't really have anything else to play, so I don't know. I might just go home and get ready for school tomorrow. I didn't want him to think I was boring, so I quickly said, Hey, how about we walk around before you go home and try to find something scary? Surprisingly, he agreed. He said, That actually sounds fun. Let's do that before I head home. But before we left, he said he needed to use the bathroom. I sat on my bed, waiting, and suddenly I felt a sharp headache that disappeared just as quickly as it came on. Right after that, Trey walked back in and said, Actually, I don't need to go to the bathroom, but I did think of a cool place to explore. I told him, sure, as long as it wasn't too far, and he promised it wasn't. But as we were leaving the house, he started speed walking in this sneaky way, which I thought was kind of funny, so I copied him. While we were walking, I tried talking to him, but he wasn't responding, which I did find a bit weird. I figured he just had a lot on his mind since he'd been going through some stuff at the time, and after about 5 minutes of quiet speed walking, we arrived at this big, empty building. As soon as we got there, Trey says, Okay, we're here. Let's have some fun and explore. I agreed, and we found a way in through a side window. As soon as we entered the building, I felt this cold shiver run down my spine, almost like my body was screaming at me. I asked Trey if he felt weird too, and in a deep and slow tone, he says, I don't feel anything. Now that freaked me out. but I tried not to overthink it. I wasn't alone, so, what could go wrong, right? We walked towards a staircase and had two options, go up or down. I was deciding which way to explore when Trey says, "Let's go down first. I think it'll be more fun and interesting, don't you?" I hesitated, but eventually said, "Yeah, I guess." As we started down the stairs, he rushed past me and stood at the bottom near a door, saying in that same creepy tone, "Are you coming?" Something in me screamed, "No," and I got scared. I told him I was ready to go home, and he replies with, "Fine, suit yourself. I'll just explore without you." I didn't care. I just said goodbye and I ran home. I'd got back in about 2 minutes or so and headed up to my room, only to find Trey already sitting on my bed. He says, "All right, let's go exploring now that you're done being weird." I was completely confused. How did he get here so fast? And how did he get into my house without me noticing? I asked him how he got back home so quickly. I knew he wasn't faster than me, and he just looks at me and he says, "What are you talking about? I never left, and neither did you." I'm terrified at this point. I asked him, "Then where was I?" He told me that after he came out of the bathroom, I was sitting on the bed, telling him that instead of exploring, we should just hang out and talk. He thought it was weird, but agreed to wait in my room while I did whatever I said I was going to do. I stood there, frozen in fear, and honestly, I started crying. He didn't know what to do, so he just left and walked home by himself. I wanted to tell my parents, but they didn't believe me the first time that I told them something strange had happened. So why would they believe me now? I always think back on it and I wonder, what if I had said yes and went down into the basement with him that night? "Hey, look, that guy wants to speak to you." In 2018, I transferred with one of my friends to a university in Paris. And since we were broke and rent is very high there, we ended up renting a small studio apartment there in one of the worst neighborhoods in Paris. Alongside our studies, we had to do some student jobs in order to afford food and rent. We had no help from the government, and our families were poorer than we are. The first job we did was an inventory job, and the shifts were from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. Just terrible. Our sleep schedule was ravaged, and we had to go to uni in the morning too. This story happens on a winter night where I wasn't scheduled to work, but my friend was. I got out late from uni, and it was a particularly cold day. As I enter the apartment building, I see a homeless man in the hall sleeping. I didn't think much of it. I thought he was protecting himself from the cold outside. I go to our studio on the 13th floor, eat, and get to my bed. I pull out my laptop and my headphones and I launch some show on Netflix. I was so absorbed by it until I heard my friend getting home. It was already 4 a.m. My friend was so tired that he went straight to bed. I continued watching my show. Then 20 minutes later, I see my friend gesturing at me from his bed, so I take off my headphones and he tells me, "Hey, look, that guy wants to speak to you." I turn my head and I see a face like 10 centimeters away from mine, in the dark, only lighted by my laptop screen. That was the scariest jump scare of my life. I quickly got out of bed and I turned the lights on while the guy was mumbling something, and as I turned, I recognized him as the homeless guy who was in the hall from earlier. I asked him why he's here and how did he even get in. He was just saying sorry and sorry over and over and that he would leave now. I said, no, I'm going to call the police. And he said, no, please don't call the cops. Now at this point, I see that he's no threat. So I asked him if he took anything in the apartment. He said no, and he showed me his empty jeans pockets. I tell him, all right, just get out. And so he does, and I lock the door behind him. I turned back to my friend who was still in bed, and he was like, is he gone? I said, yeah. And he says, okay, good night. And then falls back to sleep. And honestly, as if nothing had just happened, I went back to watching my show. When we wake up the following day, we start recollecting what happened in the night, and it just dawned on us as to how badly that could have gone. So my friend tells me that when he got home, the homeless man was sleeping in the lift. And since he's probably the last one to use the lift, it just stayed on our floor. Our hypothesis is when the homeless man woke up, he just got out and tried every door until he hit ours and found it unlocked. My friend was so tired, he forgot to lock the door. My friend tells me that he saw from his bed a shadow gesturing at me, and since he was in that weird transitional mode between asleep and awake, it took him some time to realize that there was a stranger in our apartment. And when he realized, he gestured at me to get up. We were lucky that he was inoffensive. I mean, he could have attacked us. He could have robbed us, or I don't know what could have happened. Maybe something even worse. After that event, we stayed 5 more months and then got the F out of that neighborhood.